All right, welcome back from lunch. We are going to start today with Chris Cosma. Chris is a PhD candidate at UC Riverside. His research focuses on how climate change is affecting moths and their interactions with native plants in California.
All right, can everyone hear me? All right, I'll stand closer. Good. Okay. Still can't hear me? Good. All right. Well, welcome. Thanks everyone for being here. Hope everyone had a good lunch. So thank you for that introduction. I am a PhD candidate at UC Riverside in the Rafferty Lab, and most of my research focuses on moths. But I'm going to begin this talk today about prioritizing California native plants for butterfly and moth conservation with a species that I suspect everyone here is probably familiar with. Is it? Oh, was that not showing? Sorry. That's my title. And the species is the monarch butterfly. So you may know that just 3 months ago, in July of this year, the IUCN officially listed the monarch butterfly as an endangered species. And this historic move was in part motivated by the fact that in 2020, the Western monarch Thanksgiving count, which is the census that tallies the population that overwinters here in California, in 2020 they counted fewer than 2,000 individual monarchs. And so here on the x-axis we have in the green bars the Western monarch population through time, and this 2020 plummet here represented actually an over 99% decline in this population since around the 1980s. And like many of you here, I've been learning about the monarch butterfly since I was a child, and I'm not a butterfly hater, even though I study moths. But the fact is, like any charismatic species that we study, the monarch butterfly is a poster child for a much larger issue. So here in the United States, around half of the butterfly species that have been assessed recently in 2021 by Crossley et al. Are in decline. And that's over 200 species of butterflies. And those declines are the most apparent actually here in the Southwest, including a large portion of California and other parts of the Western United States. And so this is a heat map from that paper that's just showing in the warmer colors the highest rates of decline in butterfly abundance. And so you can see in the red there, a lot of California is not doing so well in terms of butterflies. Some work by Matt Forrester at UNR has found that butterfly abundance in the western U.S. has been declining by about 1.6% per year over the last 4 decades. And really importantly, they found that dozens of species besides the monarch butterfly are in decline, including many species that are actually even more at risk than the monarch butterfly. And this includes species like the West Coast lady that's pictured here, super common butterfly across the western U.S., but again, super threatened and in decline. So let's take a step back and look at the broader picture here. And so the insect order Lepidoptera includes both butterflies and moths. It's one of the most diverse groups of insects. In California alone, we have around 240 butterfly species. And we know right now from the studies that I just presented that most of those species, about half of them, are in decline right now. Now, like I said, I study moths, so I'm going to be talking a lot about moths today. And so what about the around 5,000 moth species that we have in California? Well, the answer is we don't really know how their populations are doing because unlike butterflies, no one's really studied their long-term population trends. But we do have comprehensive data sets from other parts of the world, including in Britain, where they've found that moth abundance has declined by about 33% over the last 50 years or so. So here's that downward trend that they found, and one of their study species, the Sussex emerald. All right, so Lepidoptera butterflies and moths are declining. Why does that matter? Why do we care? Well, like I said, Lepidoptera are one of the most diverse groups of insects. They're actually the second most diverse insect order. In California, or in North America alone, we have over 14,000 species. And something that's often met with a lot of surprise is the fact that 95% of those species in the order Lepidoptera are moths and not butterflies. And so moths are over 10 times more diverse than butterflies, and here we just have the Lepidoptera phylogeny showing the evolutionary relatedness between Lepidoptera species in the order, and the small highlighted section that we see up here are butterflies. Everything else in this order are moths. All right, so they're super diverse, but we also know that moths and butterflies play critical roles in ecosystems. As larvae, or as caterpillars, more commonly known, they are really important herbivores, taking in that plant energy. And then in their larval stage and also their adult stage, butterflies and moths are eaten by organisms like birds and bats. And in these two roles as herbivores and prey for birds, bats, and other animals, Lepidoptera actually transfer more energy from plants to other animals than all other herbivores combined. So they're really, really critical components of our terrestrial food webs here, taking in that plant energy and transferring it up the food chain. And again, they do this better than any group of insects. Some of the work of Doug Tallamy has shown that caterpillars can make up 90% of the diet of some of our native songbirds. And they're really especially important for rearing baby chicks, so really important for our baby birds. If you haven't looked into the work of Doug Tallamy, read some of his books like Nature's Best Hope, I highly recommend doing so. A lot of my own research is inspired by his work. All right. So they're important herbivores, transferring that food up the food chain. And one of the ways they do that is by serving as the primary food source for some of our native bat populations in the West. So some bats are actually moth specialists, meaning that they almost exclusively rely on moths in their diet. And in light of these figures, it's really no surprise that Lepidoptera declines, including here in the US, have been linked to declines in our native songbirds and bats. And so again, some of the work of Doug Tallamy has shown that insectivorous birds, so birds that predominantly rely on insects in their diet, have declined by 2.9 billion individuals over the last 50 years. And I should have said this at the beginning, there's gonna be a lot of depressing stuff in the first part of this talk, but I promise the whole second half is about the hopeful stuff and what we can do about it. So again, our insectivorous birds declining, not doing well. Compared to that, non-insect eating birds, so birds that rely on grains and other sources of food, have actually increased by 26.2 million individuals. So this is really compelling evidence that the declines that we're seeing in our birds, and they've also shown this in bats, are very tightly linked to these declines and probably driven by these declines in their food sources, which predominantly for insectivorous birds are Lepidoptera. All right, so we know they're super diverse. We know they're important prey and important herbivores, but another thing we know about Lepidoptera are that they're important pollinators. And bees aside, with just focusing on Lepidoptera here, butterflies get most of the credit here. So most of us know that butterflies are going around visiting our plants, transferring pollen from plant to plant. But there's more and more evidence, including from my own research, that moths are actually probably much more important pollinators of our wild and our agricultural plants. And in California, we have a lot of great examples of this, such as hawk moth pollination of Datura. And so, again, our native California plants are pollinated by moths to an extent that we don't really know yet, but some of my other research that I'm not going to talk about today is hopefully going to shed some light on this. All right, so Lepidoptera, I hope I've shown you, are really important components of our ecosystems. So we want to conserve these services that humans in part rely on. And doing that requires an understanding of why they have been so impacted by global change. And this is a really hard question to answer. David Wagner in 2021 described the global threats to insects as death by 1,000 cuts. And this is the idea that there are just so many threats being thrown at insects and really all organisms from all sides from human activity that it's really hard in most cases to determine the main cause behind any decline in a single species. And more often than not, it's probably a combination of multiple interacting factors. And those can range from things like habitat loss to introduced and invasive species, to pollution, including light pollution, which is really bad for nocturnal organisms like moths. We have pesticide use in our agricultural fields, including pesticides that we use at our homes. And then we have the myriad effects of climate change. And that can range from things like increased drought to increased intensity and frequency of forest fires. And I want to focus in on the effects of climate change here. This heat map that I showed you earlier showing the highest rate of butterfly abundance decline in the red here in the Southwest, including parts of California. What they found in this study is that a lot of that decline can be explained by recent climate change in this area. And so what they're showing in the bottom panels here, B and C, are the species abundance trend. So for below zero, we have a decrease. If we're above zero on the y-axis, we have an increase. Panel B is showing precipitation increasing on the x-axis, and panel C is showing temperature increasing on the x-axis. So what they found here is that there's this really tight correlation between declining butterfly abundance and lower precipitation in panel B and higher temperatures in panel C. And that's exactly what we're seeing with climate change, especially in the Southwest. It's becoming much hotter and drier, and that is really bad for butterflies, as they're showing here, and probably most organisms. All right, so in summary, butterflies, like all our insects and many other groups of organisms, are being impacted by all of these different global change drivers. But one thing that we know about Lepidoptera, and especially from our friend the monarch butterfly, is that Lepidoptera have these extremely tight reliances on native plants. And so the monarch is what we call a host plant specialist, and this means that its caterpillars can only eat milkweed plants. They can only develop milkweed plants to gain the energy they need to transform into adult monarch butterflies. And we know that specialist species are at greater risk of extinction under environmental change because they're more easily decoupled from these native plant resources. And so I'm going to go through a quick example of that here. Let's say we have on the other side of the spectrum an ecological generalist. And a generalist species is just one that can rely on many different interaction partners. If we're talking about host plants for caterpillars, a caterpillar that has many different host plant species. And so the local extinction or the local loss of any one plant from this community is not likely to have a large negative impact on this generalist species because, again, it has all those other alternative interaction partners that it can rely on. Now, if we take the monarch butterfly and ecological specialist, that same plant extinction is likely to have a very negative impact on that species because, again, it's the only plant it can rely on. And so the monarch butterfly is not alone in this host plant specialization. In fact, 90% of all plant-eating insects, including the majority of butterfly and moth species, are host plant specialists. And overwhelmingly, this means that they are specialists on their native plant partners. And that's because of millions of years of shared coevolutionary history in which these interactions have been fine-tuned. And that's why we know it's so important to plant native plants for insects, native plants for all sorts of wildlife, because of this shared coevolutionary history. And what exactly does host plant specialization mean? Well, in the case of the monarch butterfly, it means that that species can rely on a certain lineage of plants. Monarchs can pretty much feed on any species of milkweed, but sometimes it literally means that they can only feed on a single species of plant. And so I've been talking a lot about host plants here, our caterpillars feeding on their host plants, but one thing I want to emphasize, and part of what puts Lepidoptera so at risk, is that they rely on native plant resources at each stage of their life cycle. So I'm going to review the Lepidoptera life cycle here to really emphasize this point. And this is going to show pictures of the monarch, but remember, this applies to all of our native butterfly and moth species. So eggs are deposited on our native host plants, and so you've probably seen eggs like this on some of your native plants. Our caterpillars are highly specialized on their native host plants, often only able to eat those species. Even things like chrysalis and cocoon placement requires plant resources, and so this benefits from diverse native plant resources as well. And then finally, we have our adults, which drink flower nectar, and in doing so, help pollinate plants. And there's been studies showing that native plants are often more attractive to butterflies and moths, and also more nourishing, so they provide greater nutritional content as well. All right, so just focusing on those two main resource use life stages, the caterpillar and the adult, it becomes very clear that Lepidoptera need both their native host plants as well as their native nectar plants. And again, those host plants are the plants eaten by our caterpillars, and the nectar plants are the plants visited and often pollinated by the adult Lepidoptera. And so in light of this, it's really no surprise that Lepidoptera declines, including right here in California, have been shown to be driven by the loss of native hosts and nectar plants due to things like habitat destruction and climate change and all those other global change factors that I talked about. All right, so that's the end of most of the depressing stuff here. I want to transition into what we can do about it. What can we do about Lepidoptera declines, and what I've been doing about it to hopefully help many people in California start supporting Lepidoptera. And we know from the monarch butterfly that an integral part of the answer to this question is planting native plants. Again, because of those tight coevolutionary histories between native plants and native insects, native plants support up to 15 times more native Lepidoptera than are introduced in ornamental plants that most of the time we're using in landscaping. And in the context of climate change, it's really, really critical to increase the extent and connectivity of diverse native habitat to ensure climate change resiliency. So we see a lot of focus on things like habitat corridors, connecting habitats across roads or other barriers. But in landscapes that increasingly look something like this, part of increasing this connectivity of our native habitat is using any amount of space that's available to us, including the space that we're directly in control of. And so any yard or garden can be an important part of this and serve as an insect way station, a stopover point for our native insects. And there have been studies showing that milkweed gardens on private lands do contribute to effective monarch conservation. So just looking at this one species, and that's why we see signs like Save the Monarchs, plant milkweed. And here's at my own house, just in a pot on my patio, planted narrow leaf milkweed and had some monarchs develop on it. All right. So I know I'm preaching to the choir in this audience about the importance of planting native plants for insects and other wildlife, but I really do think that we can all improve the way we plant native for insect conservation. And so the first step of that is realizing that the monarch butterfly is not the only butterfly species, is not the only insect species that's at risk. So we plant milkweed because the monarch's at risk, but as the list of threatened or endangered Lepidoptera grows, which it is, the list of native plants that we need to support them also grows. And so effective Lepidoptera conservation requires moving from this restricted focus on individual species and interactions, and instead transitioning to the entire community. And so one of the ways that we can do that is by using ecological networks. And ecological networks are just a framework to understand the relationships, the interactions between entire communities of native plant species and entire communities of the insects that require them. And by analyzing these sorts of networks, we can identify important species for conservation, species that are more vulnerable, and this can help us prioritize species given the limited resources that we have for conservation. And so this may mean, again, our specialist insects like the monarch butterfly, these species that rely on very few native plants. But that could also mean generalist plant species that support many different insects in the community. And so in order to advance Lepidoptera conservation here in California, I've built a tool called the Butterfly Net. And this is a web application. You can access it at the web address posted here. It does work best on a computer or a tablet, but you can also scan the QR code to see that website. And don't worry, I'll show this again at the end, but this is a tool to help people find the best hosts and nectar plants for butterflies and moths anywhere in California. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to go through how I built this app and why we need it. And so this app relies on a comprehensive data set called California Plants as Resources for Lepidoptera, and this is a naturalist guide. I believe it's available on several of the CNPS websites. Which was compiled by this guy named Jeffrey Caldwell, who was a restorationist and native gardener in the Bay Area. I believe he's retired and currently living somewhere in the Midwest. But this is a super comprehensive and statewide data set detailing the interactions between butterflies and moths in California and their native hosts and nectar plants. And so what we've done first is we digitized this data set, and we converted it into the interaction matrices that we use to model and analyze the sorts of ecological networks that I've been showing here. And so this is a massive data set. We have something like 16,000 individual interactions recorded here, so it's really hard to visualize such large networks. But I want to point out first that we have two different types of interaction networks here. We have our flower visitation network, and that is detailing the interactions between our adult butterflies and moths and their nectar plants. And then we have the herbivory network, and this is detailing the interactions between caterpillars and their host plants. And so what I'm showing you here are called circle graphs. And again, it kind of looks like a mess, so you can't really see anything, and you're not meant to. But what you see here on the outside here as a continuous line of color is actually thousands of different plant and insect species represented by these squares connected through the rest of their network through their interactions. And so between these two networks, we have thousands of plant and insect species and thousands of interactions that we've recorded. And so through analyzing this data set, I've arrived at three important considerations in order to more effectively support entire communities of threatened butterflies and moths in California. And the first step is planting native host and nectar plants. Number two, we have to prioritize the most important plant species. And number three, we have to consider geographic variation in species and interactions. I'm going to go through each of these points here. But before I get to point one, I actually want to touch on the importance of considering geographic variation, because a lot of my results for the first 2 points rest on this. And so we all know that California is a huge and very diverse state. And not only do we have a diversity of species across the state, but we also have a diversity of habitat types and a diversity of interactions between species in those habitat types. And all of these things can vary with latitude, with elevation, with distance from coasts, and other factors like this. And so to emphasize the importance of geography here, let's look again to the monarch butterfly. There are about 15 native milkweed species occurring in slightly different regions across California. So here we have our milkweed species represented by different colors. This is giving you a rough idea of their ranges. And we know that it's really important to plant local species. And part of the reason is because not doing that risks confusing monarch migration patterns, introducing harmful parasites and other negative impacts on the monarch butterfly. And so expanding this idea of using local species where they belong, where they occur, I've taken California's ecoregions. And ecoregions are just areas of similar ecosystems, similar climatic conditions across the state. And so here they're colored across California here. And anywhere you live in one of these ecoregions, there's going to be a variety of different habitat types natural habitat types that occur around you. And so these are often the types of habitat types that we emulate when we plant native gardens and do native landscaping. And so just an example here showing some of them in San Jose where we are now. We have anything from mixed chaparral to different types of grasslands. And within those habitat types, in those ecoregions, there's going to be Lepidoptera and plant species that occur across those habitat types. Some of them may be restricted to certain habitat types. Some of them may occur across many different habitat types. And so what I've done is I've layered species occurrence data, both plants and Lepidoptera, and I've layered that over our habitats and our ecoregions in California, and this allows me to extract anywhere where you may live or anywhere where you're doing work in California a local interaction network comprised just of the species that occur near you and are interacting near you in that specific habitat type. And so the first thing you do when you use the app is you input your address, and you can enter the address in the search bar, or you can click on where you live or wherever you want on the map, and then you hit the Find Plants button, and the first thing the app is going to tell you is the ecoregion that you occur in. And so these are the EPA ecoregions. I'm working on transitioning to the Jepson ecoregions, which is what CalScape and CNPS uses. And then it's going to give you the option of what type of habitat type. It's going to search around you for the 5 natural habitat types that are closest to your area, which are probably the ones that you should be trying to emulate. And you can choose which one you're planting after. And then you can choose to focus on host plants, nectar plants, or both, and butterflies, moths, or both. So maybe you want to put in a butterfly pollinator garden, or you want to put in a moth herbivore garden. Or you just want to focus on everything at once. And what it's going to do after you make your selections is it's going to spit out a list of the most important plant species in that area to support your local Lepidoptera. And I'm going to go through how this works and what the different highlights and stuff mean later. And when you scroll down in the app, it's also going to show you those local interaction networks. So you can actually visualize like which species are interacting in my area, what does that look like? And on the left, we have the nectar plants, and on the right, we have the host plants interacting with the Lepidoptera. Alrighty, so coming back to my first point here, the importance of planting native hosts and nectar plants. So we see a lot of emphasis on things like pollinator gardens, and these are often focused on providing those showy flowers for our adult butterflies and bees as they pollinate. On the other side of the spectrum, we see focus in conservation efforts, like with the monarch, a focus on planting just their host plant. But remember, Lepidoptera require native plant resources at each stage of their life cycle. And so there's a body of evidence pointing to the fact that resource use in larval and adult stages independently determine extinction risk in Lepidoptera species. And really interestingly, the loss of monarch nectar plants could actually contribute more to their decline than the loss of milkweed. So there's a couple of papers supporting this idea. And what this is telling us is that conservation efforts really must consider resource dependencies at each life stage. Not just the caterpillars and what they need, not just the adults and what they need, but both at the same time. And so this data set really affords us an unparalleled opportunity to do this across the entire state of California. And so what I've found by analyzing these networks is kind of confirming what other studies have found, is that caterpillars are much more specialized than adults. And so in our herbivory network, our caterpillars have an average of 3.6 host plants per species. Whereas in the flower visitation network, they have an average of 14.7 nectar plants per species. So again, our caterpillars are much more specialized. And this specialization in part makes the caterpillar stage more sensitive to plant extinctions. And so what we've done is performed plant extinction simulations, which is just a computer simulation taking plants out of those networks and showing what may happen to the caterpillar species or the adult butterflies and moths that rely on those plants. And so it only takes an average of 1.4 plant extinctions to drive one insect extinct in the herbivory network, whereas in the flower visitation network, it takes an average of 6.25 plant extinctions to drive one insect extinct. So again, the caterpillar stage is much more sensitive to plant species loss. All right. So this is telling us that caterpillars are picky eaters, and we have to be picky in choosing which host plants to provide them. I'm going to go fast here because I'm running out of time. So looking at this data in a slightly different way, we have number of host plants on the x-axis and the percent of Lepidoptera species with that number of host plants on the y-axis. A full 43%, almost half of Lepidoptera species in California have just one host plant, and 73% have 3 or fewer host plants. So again, the vast majority of caterpillars are host plant specialists. And this emphasizes the importance of planting those host plants. But really importantly, we found that Lepidoptera use discrete hosts and nectar plants. So this is a complicated plot here. This is called an NMDS, is just showing, visualizing complex community data here. So each point here represents a group of either host plants in blue or nectar plants in gold here. And the distance between those points, any 2 points, corresponds to how different the composition of plants are in those communities. And this is across ecoregions and across habitats in California. So the fact that we're seeing these really distinct groupings of host plants and nectar plants separated from one another is telling us, again, statistically significant difference in the use of host plant and nectar plants. All right, so this first bar here, we found that the caterpillar stage is more specialized, and that makes them more vulnerable to potential plant species losses. But we also saw here at the end that Lepidoptera use discrete hosts and nectar plants. And so while we see an emphasis often on supporting one life stage or the other, effective Lepidoptera conservation really means including or protecting both native hosts and nectar plants. And this is a sign at the UCR Botanic Gardens, which emphasizes this point. All right, moving on to point number 2, the importance of prioritizing the most important plant species. All right, so California is a biodiversity hotspot. There are over 6,500 native or endemic plant species here, and of those, about 1,900 of them are included in this data set as known Lepidoptera host or nectar plants. And so this still leaves us with a tremendous number of species to choose from if our goal is to protect butterflies and moths. And so we have some prioritizing to do here. And I want to begin this conversation of how we prioritize with an unfortunate reality, which is that we're not going to be able to save everything. Again, remember, about half of butterfly species, over 200 species in the U.S. are declining, some of them even more than the monarch, especially here in the southwestern parts of California. So this begs an important question: which species should we focus on providing resources for? And the way that conservation has worked in the U.S. and other countries traditionally is focusing on those rare and declining or already endangered species like the monarch butterfly. But there's growing understanding that maybe instead we should be focusing on planting those plants that provide resources for as many species as possible. And a great example of that in California is Ceanothus, which supports not 1 or 2, but hundreds of Lepidoptera species, butterflies, and moths. But I want to emphasize a point here that this question is not always black and white, and these are not necessarily mutually exclusive goals here. And so the way that I prioritize species is coming back to an old but really important concept in ecology called the keystone species concept. And keystone species are just those species out in our ecosystems that are disproportionately important to the rest of the system. And that's like the keystone here in our Roman arch. And so I'm running out of time. What I'm showing here are these accumulation curves that's going to show you the percent of plant species on the x-axis that support a certain percent of Lepidoptera species on the y-axis. And so I'm showing this for both our host plants in blue and our nectar plants in gold. And so just to reach that 90% of Lepidoptera supported line up there, we only need about a third of host plant species, so 32% of host plant species, and 9.3% of nectar plant species. So again, a relatively small percentage of plant species are the ones out there doing the most work, and these are our keystone species. These are the ones we need to be prioritizing. All right, we can take this keystone species concept a step further with network analysis by analyzing what's called network modularity. And this is just the tendency of groups of species within networks to form these compartments of more closely interacting species. So here's our whole network with the shaded regions being our modules. And within these modules, we have two really important roles. Our module hubs are species that are highly connected within their own module. And our module connectors are those species that connect different modules. And really importantly, the loss of these species are predicted to lead to cascading extinctions across the rest of the network. So these are those species providing stability. Again, these are our keystone species. And we can perform this kind of modularity analysis at both local scales. So a local scale could just be a habitat within a specific ecoregion. But we can also do this at a landscape scale. And we can, using relatively new methods, analyze what's called these meta-networks, which are describing networks across a landscape, linking different habitat types to one another. So we can find these species that connect these different habitat types across an entire landscape. And so that list of priority plant species that the app is going to show you are these keystone species. In the background, this sort of network modularity analysis is being done. And so organized from most important at the top, these are those species that are providing that stability to the rest of the community. And so really importantly, this ranking method does not necessarily sacrifice our rare or threatened species. And so I want to focus on the milkweed monarch relationship to emphasize this point. So you may be asking, what are the blue highlights in this list? Well, the blue highlight's going to show you that that plant supports a rare or endangered plant species. Oh my God. And so our narrow leaf milkweed here, and what you'll notice is that milkweed species are often at the tops of these lists. And that's because even though we know it as the monarch plant, milkweed is a super important plant for many other species. So we host 4 other Lepidoptera species in California, including one of my favorites here, the Cleo tiger moth. And we provide nectar for 104 Lepidoptera species. So milkweed is a really, really important nectar plant, not just for the monarch, but for many different species in California. All right, so concluding this section, I'm going to go through the last section real quick. We saw that few keystone plant species support the majority of Lepidoptera species, and that this community-level plant ranking does not necessarily sacrifice our rare or threatened species. Okay, coming to the last point, considering geographic variation in species and interactions. So I showed you how I use those ecoregions and habitats to extract our local networks, and this is going to, wherever you live, show you your local network where that modularity analysis is going to be conducted on to find those most important plants where you live. And the reason this is important because the identity of these top 10 plant species varies significantly between those ecoregions. So this is another one of those big NMDS plots. And this is a lot to look at. So what I did is I just summarized the mean and standard error of these clusters. So each cluster here is a group of the 10 most important plant species in a specific ecoregion. And we're seeing a statistically significant difference in the identity of these top 10 species depending on which ecoregion you're in. We also saw the same difference between habitat types in a single ecoregion. So this is just an example from Southern California where I live. All right, I'm going to speed through this. Results almost done here. And these differences make sense when we focus in on how individual species importance varies across the landscape. So here I'm just showing plant importance on a scale of 0 to 1, and this is determined through that modularity analysis, and our different ecoregions on the x-axis roughly from north to south. So I'm going to plot different species on here. We have Achillea millefolium. We see that although it's near the top of the scale, for the most part, it does vary across these ecoregions, with a peak in the central basin area. Plotting narrow-leaf milkweed here, we see a slightly different pattern, getting more important in the southern part of its range. Again, a different pattern for chamise, and yet a different pattern for California mugwort. So we can see that not only are they varying in importance across ecoregions, but they also vary in importance from one another. Yarrow is a really good butterfly plant, pretty much wherever you are. California mugwort, not so much. I'm not saying not to plant it for other reasons, but it's not a great Lepidoptera plant. All right, so the identity of the top 10 plant species varies significantly between ecoregions and habitats, and the importance of individual plant species also varies through the landscape. What I want to do next with this data is look at climate change projections. So these current communities are the communities that we see based on occurrence data. What we know with climate change is that the ranges of these species are going to be shifting, often northward and often up in elevation. And so what I want to do is combine this network analysis with species distribution modeling in order to determine what our future communities are going to look like and what plants are going to be the most important for promoting stability with climate change. All right, so ending on some good news here. I showed you that 2020 plummet in the monarch butterfly, but there is a good part of this story, and that's that in 2021, the western monarch population rebounded almost 100-fold compared to its 2020 plummet. And part of this success is because of milkweed planting efforts, but again, it's not just the monarch that's at risk. And with the butterfly net, we can all start finding the best plants for butterflies and moths anywhere in California. Thank you for tuning in. I'm at time, so I don't have time for questions, I assume. But yeah. Yeah, so here, thank you to everyone who's helped me on this, including some people in this room right here. The QR code is on the bottom left. The web address is on the top. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that really fascinating talk. Next up, we have Rebecca Wayman. Rebecca is a research scientist at UC Davis. Her research focuses on effects and drivers of forest disturbances, such as wildfire and bark beetle-induced tree mortality.
I'll wait a second while a little shuffle between butterflies and forests goes on here. Well, thanks for that. That was a fascinating talk. I was happy to hear all of that, and I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to be talking with you today about some work that we're wrapping up now, looking at how the management practice of dead tree removal affects understory plants in areas that were hit very hard by recent severe bark beetle and drought-induced tree mortality in the Sierra Nevada. And so before I get into the research questions, I just want to give you a little background on this extreme tree mortality event that occurred during the recent severe drought. And these maps show cumulative tree mortality progression between 2015 and 2018. One thing to note here is that, and this is just the Sierra Nevada, one thing to note is that the severe mortality was really concentrated in the central and southern Sierras, and that the bulk of the mortality, kind of the peak mortality, was occurring in 2015 and 2016, although that mortality, is kind of the elevated mortality, continued and is still, and to some extent, ongoing. And so one thing to think about is what was the cause of this extreme tree mortality that was really unprecedented in recent history. And it was essentially, like, kind of to simplify, it was tree water stress. And so this was not just due to hot and dry conditions from the extreme drought. It was also due to water stress from kind of overly dense forests that had been just increasing density over the last 150 years at least, leading to kind of extreme water competition between trees. So it's both of these things put together. The forced cessation of indigenous burning practices really was what led us on this trajectory of increasingly dense forests with this high competition for water. And so as the drought hit, we had these two factors coming together, and there was just massive tree mortality as trees were bark beetles overwhelmed trees' natural defenses, and we had severe tree mortality, and around 160 million trees potentially over these several years died in the state of California, in the Sierra Nevada, concentrated in conifers. All right, so I got to thinking about what this severe tree mortality would look like for the understory plant community. So we know that there are plants that are adapted to kind of shaded environments with potentially sort of deep litter and deep duff. There's also a lot of understory plants adapted to conditions that low intensity fire might create, like a little bit higher light levels, more bare ground, more shallow litter. But what about in this sort of novel scenario where we have an increase in light, but we don't have an increase in bare ground? In fact, kind of the opposite. We have potentially increased litter inputs followed by increased fine fuels and then coarser fuels as these trees are, the dead standing trees are kind of losing their parts that's falling down into the forest understory, and eventually whole trees are coming down to the forest floor. So what does that scenario look like for the understory plant community? And specifically, how would the management practice of removing dead trees soon after this mortality event affect understory plant species richness, diversity, cover, and community composition? So to answer this question, we located 6 different sites throughout the central and southern Sierra Nevada that we found were suitable for our sampling design. And what we did was we took great care to locate areas where dead trees were removed, but there was an arbitrary boundary between the tree removal and then the untreated areas, arbitrary ecologically, so that we could pair plots on either side of this boundary that would be, aside from the tree removal, otherwise kind of physically and ecologically similar. So we made sure that our treated and control plots had similar slope, aspect, topography, kind of pre-mortality tree species composition, and pre-treatment levels of mortality. So before those dead trees were removed, was the overall tree mortality generally similar between the two. And with that, we established 126 plots, or 63 pairs. And these were all in Sierra Nevada mixed conifer at sort of these middle elevations where mixed conifer forests are most common. And then within each of these plots, which were 11.3 meter radius circular plots, that's 1/10 of an acre, or about 0.04 hectares, we estimated the percent cover of every plant species in the plot. And we collected a whole bunch of measurements on forest structure and ground covers and other parameters. We talked about litter and woody debris and site physical characteristics. We did this in 2020 and 2021. And so if you recall, the peak of the tree mortality was around 2015, 2016, some into 2017. The treatments, so the dead tree removal, was occurring between 2017 and 2020, depending on the site. And on many sites, it was kind of took several years for them to implement. It was about 4 to 6 years after tree mortality that we were collecting our data. So I'll jump right into the results. And the first result shown here is that we have green is, in all the slides I'm going to show, green is where dead trees were removed, and purple is the control, where no treatment was implemented. And you can see on the left that total understory plant species richness was higher in the treated plots. And that was the same across all these subgroups shown. So shrubs were, the asterisks indicate a significance level. So shrubs were significant at the 0.1 level, but not at 0.05. But herbs, native species, annuals were all significantly higher richness, so total number of species in treated plots. Let's see, not shown here are graminoids. There were very few graminoids. The average richness of graminoids was a little higher in treatments, but it wasn't significant. And native richness was higher, as you can see here, and annual richness was also higher. Also, we looked at Shannon's diversity index, which is a combination of richness and evenness. Shannon's diversity was higher across all these subgroups in treated plots, but when we looked at evenness on its own, there was no difference in evenness, so we determined that the diversity was really driven by richness or kind of straight species numbers. So I'm just showing this here. And let's see, I think that's all I'm going to say about that for now. So that was alpha richness or plot level richness. This graph portrays gamma richness or kind of richness across all of our plots. And it's a species accumulation curve. And what you can look at here is that across the x-axis is the number of samples. And as we increase the number of samples, so the number of plots, species are being added to the treated plots at a faster rate across the board than to untreated plots. And so that's just showing that basically the richness is not just at the plot level, it's across the whole site level that we have kind of this slightly higher number of plant species in the treated areas. All right, so we're gonna go a little deeper even here. I need to just give credit to Quinn Sorensen, my co-author, for this beautiful figure that has a lot going on. Don't worry, we're gonna break it down. So what this is a species rank abundance figure. So don't worry if you cannot read all those species codes, or even if you can read them, if you don't know what they refer to, because it's not the point of why they're up here. But essentially what this is that list of species on the y-axis is the ranking of the highest occurring species down to, this is only the top 80, so it's not all the species, but the top 80 species. And on the right, it's the ranking for the species in treated plots. On the left in purple are the ranking for species in the untreated plots. And so along the x-axis are the number of plots with that species. So if you look at the top species in the treated plots, that's Ribes roselii. It occurred in nearly 60 plots out of the 63. And so that's what the green bar going across is how many plots it occurred in. All right, and then if we look at the lines in the middle, those are connecting the same species. And if it's green, that species occurred in more plots in a treatment. And if it's purple, it occurred in more plots in a control. So then, once we're oriented here, a couple things I just want to point out. One is that at all levels, you can see that there are just more occurrences of each species in treated plots than in control plots. Those green bars are just wider. There's more occurrences there. The second thing of interest, I think, is that the most common species are really the same across treatments and controls. So those lines are kind of just, they're not diving really steeply, but as you move down the list, you see that that's where there's this huge turnover in treated and control plots in terms of who's showing up more. But what's also interesting is that most of those species are actually occurring in both treatments and controls. So there's not this complete turnover of species. There's just kind of a shuffling of their frequency. All right, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit to the community. And again, we were introduced to the ordination already, so I'll just say this real quickly. These are all plots, and this is an overview of each point represents a plot in species space, so points that are closer together have a more similar species composition to each other. And again, green treatment, purple no treatment. And what you can see here is essentially that there's not a really strong clustering of treated versus control plant communities. However, the Permanova, which tests the difference in plant community composition, is significant over all plots. And then another thing I'll say is that I oriented the next figures, all of them, with overstory cover here. So overstory cover is always coming off to the right this way. And you will see that for all the individual sites, there's just kind of a slight movement of the centroid. Sorry, I didn't say what the ellipse is. The ellipses are one standard deviation away from the centroid of that group of plots. So the green ellipse for treatment is just slightly away from overstory cover, and the purple for treatment is a little closer to overstory cover. That difference is, or at least on the Permanova, is significant. This is the one site, though, only one individual site had a significant community difference in the Permanova. You can see that there's a little bit of a bigger distance between the green and purple ellipse. And in this one, I connected plots within a pair with an arrow, so you can see kind of the direction of their movement. Again, a little bit moved away from overstory cover and toward bare cover. I'll go through these next ones quickly. These other sites, just note that they're not significant, but they all have just a slight movement of that green ellipse away from overstory cover. All right, so we did an indicator species analysis to see what were the strong indicators of treatments versus controls. And just to summarize what we found there were 3 insignificant indicators of the controls and 8 significant indicators of the treated plots. And it's all right up here that no annuals were indicators of controls. They were all shrubs and perennials, whereas 3 annuals were indicators of the controls, 3 of the 8. There was 1 semi-parasitic plant that was an indicator of the controls, and none in the treatments, and the treatments included 2 non-natives in the as indicators. So this kind of lines up with what we would expect with these treated plots, is that the environment has been opened up a little bit for plants that are potentially a little more ephemeral, a little more ruderal, kind of early colonizing type species, and that's what we're seeing in the indicators. All right, so I'll just summarize what we talked about, and I'm actually, in the summary, going to throw a couple other things at you that I didn't have time to go into deeply or show figures on. But the recent dead tree removal after the severe tree mortality was associated with an increase in understory plant species richness. This was primarily driven by herbs, and within that was primarily driven by forbs. I didn't talk about this yet, but there was a higher proportion of annual plants. That kind of goes along with also there being annual indicator species there in the treated plots. And there was also an increased cover of annuals, and there was an increased cover of non-native species. There was this decreased shrub cover in the treatments, which makes some sense in terms of the logging equipment being in there and the disturbance. She says, my time is up. Okay, and subtle changes to community composition. And the last thing I want to say is that by one management implication, this dead tree removal may benefit the understory community in the ways we've talked about, but a big caveat is that there is an increase in non-natives, which is common when logging equipment is introduced. And then I just want to say this is one piece of a bigger study. We're also looking at carbon, fuels, and future fire potential, and tree regeneration in these paired plots, so stay tuned for that early next year probably, if you're interested in those parts of the study as well. Big thanks to the crews, my co-author Quinn Sorensen, CAL FIRE for funding, Forest Service, Southern California Edison, and Mountain Home State Forest for helping us find plots and letting us put permanent plots on the lands they manage. And with that, I do not have time for questions. I do have time for questions. Okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah.
I can be loud.
Okay.
So I just learned about this, and so I don't have a ton of experience, but 2 weeks ago at the California Naturalist Statewide Conference, Don Hankins, who does a lot of this work with Chico State, was talking about, from an indigenous perspective, tree removal is a big concern because it changes the wind patterns and the other kind of weather in the space. Is that something you've considered at all in the work that you're doing?
So I have not in here, and Don Hankins is always fascinating in terms of he just finds different ways to look at everything that we're looking at. There's always a new angle that he brings into it. Where I have thought about that and where people think about it a lot is in terms of the nexus between tree mortality and fire severity a lot. I have not thought about it in the context of the understory plant community, but I could put my mind to that, and also in the sense that, you know, these annual plants with potentially wind dispersed seeds and things like that, there could be a role being played there. Yeah.
Thanks.
One more? Yeah, Zach.
My question was, I guess, can you talk a little more about the mechanism of the increase in diversity? I think you were getting at that with the ordinance a little bit, but sunlight or removal of the surface fuels if they were removed? Just you can comment on that.
Yeah, so we are still kind of diving into the environmental drivers and looking at the models to see which environmental drivers pop out. But in our initial runs, it looks like what has come out as strong is that overstory cover. I didn't mention that that's why I rotated those ordinations with overstory cover. Elevation and topographic relative moisture index, which is like a proxy for soil moisture. But it's physical. It doesn't actually have to do with biological characteristics. So the only one of those three that treatments influence is overstory cover. I'm really surprised that things like bare ground and woody debris and litter depth didn't come out in the models. And so I think there's a little more digging to do there, because I do think that while higher light might be mechanistic, there's a lot of work that is showing that, bare soil could also be mechanistic. So I think there's just more to look at there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Now, our final speaker for this session is Casey Dos Santos Allen. Casey currently works for the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission in the Wastewater Division, helping maintain green infrastructure projects in San Francisco. Welcome, Casey.
All right, thank you, everybody. This has been a fantastic conference, and I just heard a couple other people speaking about green infrastructure and some of the other sessions, and so that was good to hear, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So yeah, my name is Casey Dos Santos Allen. I help manage a team of gardeners that work on our green infrastructure projects around San Francisco. And this is an example here on Cesar Chavez. And I'm going to go through just some examples of green infrastructure, some different types of green infrastructure, so that people can understand that there's lots of different types of stormwater management green infrastructure that's being built today. If this hotel was built today, you would see all sorts of green infrastructure out in the parking lot to deal with all the rainwater that falls on here. And so I'll go through some different types of green infrastructure that you all should be looking out for. And this is mostly so people can understand that these projects are going to be happening all around the whole United States. And if you have one of these projects happening in your community, to get involved and advocate for native plants, because as with lots of projects, they can have native plants or not have native plants. It kind of depends on the jurisdiction and the landscape architects and all the people who make decisions. And you can help be one of those decision makers. You can get more native plants into these types of projects. So yeah, here's a couple. This slide shows lots of different types of green infrastructure. I'm not sure if I have a pointer at all. No. So I'll just go over from the right-hand side over here, which is showing a vegetated roof. And it's going down, and after it going through the roof and being kind of filtered or delayed, it's going into a cistern. But that could also be just going down to a disconnected rain garden below or something like that. The types of rain gardens that I tend to work on are these ones that are in the street. And rainwater is great for plants, as we all know. It's really wonderful. But when it hits a hardscape, like a street, it picks up all the pollutants, dust, and everything else that's there, and it washes it into our waterways or into our sewer system, depending on how that municipality has it set up. In San Francisco, we have a combined sewer system for most of the city. And so the stormwater goes into the sewer system, ends up at our treatment plants, and not all that pollution can really be cleaned up in that process, and it ends up getting put out into our bay and into our ocean. So all of that pollutants can go into one of these rain gardens, and the biological activity of the soil, the microbes, the fungi, the plants themselves all help to filter that water and clean it up. And even if the water ends up migrating through the system and ending up back into the sewer system or into a dual collection system where that water is just put out into a waterway, it's much cleaner after that whole process. And a lot of that water ends up getting infiltrated into the soil and goes down and helps recharge our groundwater and our aquifers. So that is a lot of what I work on. Trees are also a form of green infrastructure. They're slowing down the water. So a big part of this with our combined sewer system is that if you have a huge deluge of rain come down all at once, it can overburden our system. So anything that can slow the water down, even if it doesn't completely sequester the water, but just slows it down, can really help, especially when you have a combined sewer system, from keeping it from doing flooding downstream in neighborhoods. So trees are a form of green infrastructure. So these are some good examples of green infrastructure. So every year in San Francisco, even though we are in a fairly dry climate, we get over 10 billion gallons of rain in San Francisco. And because so much of San Francisco is a hardscape, a lot of that water, most of that water, is going to end up in our sewer system and needing to be treated. So this is all because of the Clean Water Act. We just had the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, so yay for that. That's really awesome. And because of the Clean Water Act, that directs local governments to clean up the water that's going into the local waterways. So San Francisco, like most places, has some pollution issues, and so this is one of the ways we're trying to mitigate that is by putting in green infrastructure. This slide shows just how much impervious land there really is in San Francisco. The lighter colored areas are actually, there's Golden Gate Park, there's the Presidio on the top of the slide, and so all the lighter spots are parks and open space, and all the darker spots are just urban areas. So you can see that there's a huge percentage of the overall space of San Francisco that basically needs to go into a sewer system and be processed that way. So the rain gardens and the other things I'm going to talk about are ways to reduce that. This slide shows that we, right now, the bottom tier there is Stormwater Management Ordinance, a SMO. So Stormwater Management Ordinance is something we passed in 2010, I believe, and it requires all new development in San Francisco over 5,000 square feet to install and use some mitigation strategies to deal with the rainwater and try and keep as much of that on site as possible. So this is showing that right now, we're trying to get to 1 billion gallons managed out of that 10 billion. So 10% of our rainwater to be managed by green infrastructure. And so this shows kind of where we are now and where we need to get to. But that bottom baseline is all the projects that have been done so far. That's dark blue. The light blue above that are all the projected new development that's going to happen in San Francisco that's all going to have stormwater management being part of it. And then we can see the projects that I work on, which are the capital projects. Right now existing is just that thin sliver of a line that's black, and that's the 8 early implementation projects that we built around the city. And I'll talk about those a little bit more in a few minutes. But we've got a long ways to go. We have some other capital projects that are in the planning stages right now that hopefully are going to take us up to that green bar there. And then there's a little sliver at the very top that we need to figure out, and it hasn't really been planned for yet, but we're still working on. But when we get to that, by 2050, the idea is to be 10% of the rainwater will be getting managed with green infrastructure. And that really should be, we kind of picked this number because that's what we think is going to help to prevent the flooding and the other problems that we've had with the system getting over capacity, basically, when you have a deluge of rain all at once. So that is what we're trying to do. Here are some projects. And so we have 8 watersheds in San Francisco, and each watershed got an early implementation project. These are the projects that me and my team helped to maintain. And each one has been designed differently to try out different technologies, try out different plants, try out all the different tools in our toolbox. And so it's really been a lot of fun for me because I get to go around and maintain all these different types of gardens, and there's a huge variety, and some work better than others, and we've just learned a lot through this whole process. I just heard a talk about Sunset Boulevard, and they're trying to create a biodiversity corridor all along Sunset Boulevard. Sunset Boulevard is in the west side of the city, and it actually connects the lake there at the bottom, Lake Merced, to Golden Gate Park. We just installed 30 rain gardens on Sunset Boulevard, plus 6 that we had already. So there's 36 rain gardens that go along this whole 2.5-mile corridor that is planted with native plants and is going to fit in perfectly with this biodiversity corridor that they're in the process of making. So we also have Baker Beach project that just came online that's over by Baker Beach. We've got Holloway Street, which is a street in a neighborhood over by State University and City College. We've got Visitation Valley. Yosemite Creek daylighting hasn't happened, and it's still in the planning stages. And we've got Mission Valencia Gateway, which is a collection of bioretention planters, rain gardens that are there at Mission and Valencia. We've got the Wiggle Neighborhood Green Corridor, which is a series of about 7 rain gardens that are along a bike route that's called the Wiggle that kind of wiggles through. And then Chinatown. So here's some pictures of some of those rain gardens that we get to work on. And there's a great opportunity to put native plants in rain gardens. That's part of why I'm here, is just to advocate for that. If there's a project that you hear about, know about, advocate for native plants, because it depends on a lot of different variables whether they're going to be included or not. On our public-facing stuff, we try and use mostly natives. But we get to private projects a little different. So yeah, this just shows that the green infrastructure, we monitored it. It worked really well. Some of the modeling showed that we were going to reduce the volumes by, what's on the green side, and the blue side shows what we actually did, were able to accomplish. And they removed really a lot of water from the sewer system. So some policies. This is just about the stormwater management ordinance that was passed, I believe, in 2010, and this is for all the new developments. This shows where the new developments are and where they're planning to make some. And these projects are in buildings, and we don't control them. We give them some ideas about what they can do, but they don't have to put native plants in. So that's why it's great if you know about a project that's happening to advocate. And then we also have redevelopment areas. Like Treasure Island is a huge one. There's going to be this huge project that's going to be filled with green infrastructure. This other one at Hunters Point is just a downspout has been disconnected, and that whole little area is a rain garden there. And we have programs. So we also have a stewardship grant program that helps give money to schools mostly, but places that have hardscape to rip out the hardscape. Here's just an example of they removed all this pavement and put in this wonderful rain garden to capture the water from the adjacent schoolyard. And this just shows kind of like a citywide, if we do all these different things, we've got the streetscape stuff that my crew works on. We've got new development. We've got people residentially doing this, disconnecting their downspouts using creating rain gardens on their property, and things like rain barrels and stuff like that. And then we also have some large projects that would be maybe like a school where they're going to be putting in some rain gardens. So these are examples. When you put them all together, we're hoping to get that 10% reduction. And we do provide technical assistance, which is all these great plans and stuff, so developers who are building new developments, they can get a lot of, I don't provide this, but the SFPUC provides this, right? And we also have a host of documents, books, plant palette, all these wonderful resources that if you wanted to design even a gray water system, if you want to design a rainwater catchment system, you want to know how to maintain them, how to construct them, what plants to use. We have all this stuff online to help the contractors, help the developers, help my crew, help all residents figure out how to do this work. And then we do have some strategic partnerships. We've realized that it's a lot better that if someone's MTA are folks that run our roads. If they're redoing a road anyway, if we can get in there and get them to put in green infrastructure. This is an example of our Recreation and Parks Department has a linear park that they're going to be redoing, and so we had a meeting about a year ago, and they're going to be putting in rain gardens at our request in the plan, and they're going to be actually maintaining them, which is really wonderful. Here's another example of a project that the MTA, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, is putting together where they were going to redo the street anyway, and so we were able to kind of piggyback on that and say, oh, if you can put it in these rain gardens, we'll take care of them once you build them. So that's a great way. It saves us a lot of money. And some final thoughts about rain gardens. I didn't talk too much about plant selection. We have a whole guidebook about that can help you with that. But a rain garden is going to fill up with water, and so you're going to need to pick some plants that really can deal with being submerged in the water, inundated with water for 24 to 48 hours. There's room for all types of plants because most rain gardens have a transition zone and then a higher area where you can plant things like a manzanita or something that doesn't like to get its crown wet. So there's a lot of variability and a lot of opportunity to pick a wide selection of plants, but just know that in the bottom of the rain garden, that area is really going to get inundated, so you need plants that can handle that. And if there's no irrigation being used, you need obviously, I thought when I first started this job about 2.5 years ago, that I'd be using a lot of riparian plants because I was like, yeah, rain gardens, but actually these rain gardens get really dry in the summer, so you need to pick plants like the Lamus triticioides, something like that's going to be able to be completely inundated with water and then completely dry in the summer. So those are just some things to think about. And I think that I've run out of time, so that is my talk. Thank you very much.
I think we have some time for questions.
Any idea why San Francisco doesn't have a MS4 system, the separated instead of combined?
We do have the MS4 system in the new redevelopment area. So Mission Bay is a whole new neighborhood that's been built over the last 15 years, and that has the MS4, which, and I believe Hunters Point, that whole redevelopment agency area is also going to be separated. So the MS4 is a separated sewer system where you have the sewer going to the treatment plant, and then you have all the water from the streets going directly out into a adjacent waterway. So it's really important in those situations to try and clean up the water before you just put it in a pipe and pipe all that stuff off into the bay with all the pollutants that it's going to be carrying. So.
Is there any movement within the city to mandate the usage of native plants in the private green infrastructure projects, or to offer incentives for them to use natives?
I know that there's some movement outside of city government to do that, but what I've heard from the people I work with is that they don't have any intention of doing that. But I think it might be a good idea if we had a requirement that you use native plants, but so far, they haven't wanted to go that direction in the SFPUC. But we advocate for it, we suggest it, we recommend it. But at the end of the day, we leave it up to them to make their decisions. But that's where all of you can come in and advocate for that, because I think that would be really a wonderful thing if we had more native plants in these projects.
Final question.
So do you know of any projects that are essentially akin to this concept except in the agricultural sector? And if not, do you think there would be an effective way to kind of mitigate the runoff from agricultural fields?
You know, I did hear about some folks that were doing that in the agricultural, that they were creating some buffer space between them and the streams, and then they were creating some rain garden type of facilities where it would be filtered before it went into the waterway. So I do know that there are some projects doing that. I don't have examples to give, but I've heard about that, and that obviously would make a big impact. We have a lot of nitrogen probably you're thinking of from agriculture that ends up in the local waterways. And so if we could clean up that water before it got into the local waterways, that would be really great. Thank you very much.
Oh,